Hello, hello. So today I'll give a brief introduction to React.js, and that'll be interesting to do a quiz question application. So essentially, there will be a question prompt, and you would pick from one of the choices, one of the radio buttons. So, and then we would click a button to check answers and see how we went. So I'll just focus on one question, and once you learn this pattern, you can expand it to as many questions as you want. You just repeat the same thing. Okay, so let's go. I am going to use today this environment called Code Sandbox, and the link is codesandbox.io/s/react-new, and I post that to the Zoom chat. And if you use that environment, you have to log in. Usually it could be with your GitHub account if you have one. And you would have to click fork if you cannot edit right away. Make sure you can edit, type anything in the text editor, you should be able to edit. Otherwise, you got to log in and click fork here and choose your username. If you prefer other alternatives, I think there are. If you don't know how to do it locally, that's an option. Otherwise, I think some other websites here, like these I posted, like playcode.io/react, reactplayground.vercel.app, and even React's own website, react.dev/learn/installation. I think the last one is for the local one anyway. I hope you got this environment working. So what I want to focus on is app.js. Let's focus on that. So what you see in this environment, it's like Visual Studio Code if you ever use that text editor. And you're going to see here the file explorer bar, and then the file that's open. And on the right-hand side, it's like a browser within the browser where you can see the result of my code. And you can see there's this H1 and H2 here. And if I change hello world here, it should automatically reflect on the right-hand side. Now, what you see here looks like HTML, but in the world of React, it's called JSX. But before we do that, let's just briefly introduce what React is. It's just a library on the front end that we use to build user interfaces. And we build it in a declarative way, meaning it should look a lot like HTML, but within JavaScript code. Now, this HTML that looks like HTML here within the JavaScript code is actually what's called JSX, which is just syntactic sugar for a function call to React.createElement. So if you see a babel.js website and you see try it out and click copy this code there and transpile it, let me show you babel.js.io. This is like a transpiler, means it converts the code from one version of JavaScript to another. Because the JSX and all this React stuff, it's kind of not supported natively in the browsers. We got to do this transpilation so the code becomes what's supported. So you can click try it out, and if you paste that same code that we did, it's going to show you what it looks like when it's transpiled on the right-hand side. But let me change some option here. I think there's an option so you can see the React.create. Let's see. Classic. Try that. Yeah, if I choose React runtime to classic here, I should be able to see that it's actually, every time I say, okay, div class name app, that's actually just a call to React.createElement. And the function argument is the name of the element, in this case, a div. And then you pass a second argument that's like the properties or attributes in HTML. In this case, it's class name and the value is app. You can see it's an object in JavaScript here. And then it has many children here because, you know, H1, H2 are under the div. So they're actually passed in as the third argument, which in turn is just React create element again. It's like a nested pattern. But this is just for out of curiosity, what is that syntactic sugar translating to? So I'm gonna close. By the way, I'm gonna cut and paste. I think the link might be too long. I don't know if it captures everything, but that's the translation that happens behind the scenes. Code Sandbox. What is is Code Sandbox more of an IDE or compiler? It's an environment that contains an IDE, and in this case, it's just Visual Studio. I think they use behind the scenes. Uh, compilers happening also behind the scenes. It's all hooked up in this kind of React template. There's some stuff going on behind the scenes here that's transpiling the code. And if you see public index, let me see if I can. Yeah, it's not really seen here, but yeah, it's behind the scenes. It probably uses something like Webpack. Webpack is basically it bundles everything, all the code together so that you can serve it along with your HTML page. So it's probably using something like that. I'm not really sure, but yeah. So yeah, it has an IDE. It has the compiler stuff already hooked up behind the scenes. Transpiler to be more in bundler. Anyway, let's focus on app.js here. So if you're curious how this app is injected, it's basically React. It takes care of things for you. Basically, all you have to do is declare all your document thing in a function that returns that template. Basically, if you want to, in the world of React, there's kind of parallel between HTML and React. When you talk about HTML elements, in React we call them components. When you talk about the element attributes, in React we call them props. So when you look at line 5, this is like the div component, and this class name is the prop or property. So it's kind of the same thing, but because we're doing React, it's not technically not the same, but that's why I have a different terminology. But essentially, when you want to create your own element or component in React, you just declare a function. In this case, this is the app function. And then you return some declarative JSX, something that looks like HTML. You might have noticed this class name is not just class, and that's because JavaScript language class is a reserved keyword for building, object-oriented stuff. You know, that's why they put class name for the prop instead of class. And there's some import here. It's basically importing this file, which is a CSS with some styles. If you need to declare the styles, like some classes or whatever, declare them here. And it's already imported from the file. And yeah, if you know curious about how this app is injected into the thing, because if I inspect this with the dev tools, I see there's an iframe here, and you see the body has all this stuff here. So, but if you look at the page source, there, I don't know if I can see it through this. Uh, maybe I can see it a little bit here. In this part, there's a body of an ID root. Usually this div is empty when you have a React application because React builds everything in the client side by default here. So this whole application app is injected into that alone div of the ID root. If you look at index.js, there's this call here. You see it gets element by ID, the root. That's the div with the ID root. And then it creates root at that element, and then it root.render, meaning render the React application in that div. So that single div has the whole application. And you can see the app instantiated here. And that's the injection. But that's just the boilerplate. So let's close the dev tools and get to building the quiz question. So for do that, I want to leverage some data structure here. Since we don't have a backend, like something in the behind the scenes that stores the data and serves us through a server, I'm just gonna create something in the front end. It's just an array of choices, and then that's inside an object with a question information. So let me copy that here for you. I'm gonna try to paste in the Zoom chat. And I'm gonna use that. So all I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to app.js outside the function and paste that. It's a very simple structure. It's an object, and this object has a property title, and that's the actual question for the quiz, the quiz question. And then I'm gonna have a choices property. That's an array. You see the square brackets. It's an array of objects. Each object has the property ID. That's a string, text, and whether this option or choice is correct. So this question has 4 choices because there's 4 objects in this array of choices. And make sure the ID is a string because it might not work if it's an integer, as we're doing some comparison later on. Because in HTML, the form controls, they usually use string. And if you put an integer here, you might have some problems. You got to, convert to string or vice versa. So I'd rather just have the string ID here. Anyway, this is the structure. You can change it to whatever you want. This is just an example since we don't have a backend, but this is what we'll be working with. Anyway, going back here, I'm gonna just delete this class name. I don't like that. And I'm gonna delete the H1s and whatever. So there's an empty div element. Now, the first thing I need to do if we are to remember that image that I had before. Now, let's first show this text with the prompt for the question. How to make a paragraph in HTML. So for that, it's gonna be like, oops, not that. I'm gonna do question here. You can see the object question got title. So if I look at here and I say inside the div, the way you can substitute values here for a variable is you put curly brace. And then you type the variable. In this case, we have the question, but that's an object. So it's going to give you an error. So I have to access question dot title. So the value from the title will appear here. So if you want to literally show the word question dot title, remove the curly braces, and that's what's going to appear. Okay, now put it back so you can, it's like a string interpolation kind of thing. So this is in the context of JSX, okay? You put the curly braces. I might have noticed this environment auto formats things for me. So it's just the way it is. When I save it, it auto formats everything. So might have noticed that. Anyway, we got the question of title. Now let's make the choices. Now the choices here, the way we can approach it, well, we can put an input type radio here, and that will create that radio. But the problem here that we're having is React, even though in HTML input is a self-closing tag, meaning I don't have to type like this. In the React world, it always wants you to close the element no matter what. So you can either say like this, or you can just put a slash here before the greater than if you're dealing with self-closing. Now I might have noticed there's this radio button there that I can click. Now I want to move that to a new line. So I probably want to put a div here. So today I'm not doing a lot of CSS, if not CSS at all. So it's up to you to style it later if you wish. I'm just going to focus on React. So I put a div here so I can put it in a new line. And then usually what we do with radios is we add a label, and that covers the radio itself, and there's some text there. Now the text is going to be the text for the choices. And I can see the question dot choices. If I look at any of the objects, for example, if I want to access the first one, there will be bracket, square bracket 0, because we start counting from 0. And then I would access dot text to get the actual choice text. So let's try just with the first one. Here, after the input type radio, it could be either here or there. It doesn't matter. I like to break a line to make things nicer to see. So we're going to do let's see, question dot choices brackets 0 to get the first one, and then dot text. But if I type it like this, the literal characters will appear, so I have to have the curly braces here, like that. As you can see, the first one appears there. Now, what's nice about putting the label covering the input and the text is if I click on the text, it also clicks the radio. If I had like the input separated from the label, like outside, if I click the text, nothing happens. It doesn't select it. So that's why we usually put the label covering the input like I did, so that I click and it marks. Now, this is nice, but it's kind of repetitive if I do for 1, 2, 3, 4, and even there's might be some questions with a variable number of choices. So a better approach here is to go through every choice here and do a mapping operation, right? For each of these objects, I want to map it or generate a new array, and those arrays will contain this template here. That's a very common thing whenever you have arrays and you want to create new components based on the element, on every element, you do a dot map. That's from array prototype dot map function. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take question dot choices and I'm going to map. Now, remember, I always put the curly brace, otherwise the thing is not going to work. Now put the curly braces surrounding it. Now I'm going to map what? I need to pass a callback function. You could pass an arrow function or a normal function like that. If I do arrow function, open the braces, equal sign greater, and then you can open curly brace. I'm going to be explicit, so not implicit. And the argument here is the choice object, so I can name it whatever I want. I think choice is a proper name. And here I have to return the new thing that I want to map. For every element in the choices array, I want to generate this template. So I can return this thing if I cut and paste it here. So usually when we have multi-line template, a JSX, you can put like a parentheses like this and paste it there, fix the indentation like that. Save it. Now, you might have noticed 4 of them were created, but they all have the same text. That's because I didn't change my index here. See this index? Shouldn't be like that because I'm no longer accessing, already mapping through the choices. So I should just get the choice instead of question.choices. So I can put choice.text there because every iteration, the choice object will be different. Now I can see the correct choices as they are reflected here. Okay, that's cool. I can click the text, but you notice how this is supposed to be only one single choice. It's selecting all of them. That's because in HTML, you need to, if you want this to be grouped into a single like selection thing, you must set the name attribute of every single radio to be the same. So if we go here where we have the input, add a name prop. In React, we call it prop instead of attribute. And here just can give it a unique name or whatever. Let's say question dash choice. Doesn't really matter because all of these will be mapped to the same name. Therefore, I'll be able to, when I click, it will uncheck the other ones that was previously selected. Okay, so any questions so far? Hope all is good. All right, so now what we want to do is, okay, I can select one of them. You've noticed that every object has a correct property that tells me whether that's the correct answer. So we want to be able to check the answers. So to do that, I'll add a button here. After I do my mapping, before the end of the div, I'll add a button here, type button. And this button will be to check the answers when I click. Now, nothing happens when I click right now. Now to check the answer, I'll make sure to When I click the button, it will do something. Now, to add on-click event listener here in React World, it's similar to HTML when you add the on-click attribute. But here you have to add on-click like this with the C capitalized, because that's a camel case. And then you have to pass, in HTML, it's like a function name and then parentheses, but in React World, it's just the function definition. That's the name of the function. In this case, I'll call check answers. Check answers here, and I go before the return for the app, I'll declare that function, check answers. And you read that right. I'm declaring a function inside a function. Anyway, so we need a way here to signal that the answers are to be verified. So one way to do that React is we have to introduce the concept of state, but let me see if we should backtrack a little bit, because I need to know what answer I selected. There's no way right now, if I click one of them, how do I know what's selected? So typically we want to keep track of that within the JavaScript code. And one way you could do that is set a variable and like select a choice ID, because every choice kind of has an ID that's unique to the choice. So I can use that to keep track of what's selected. So select a choice ID. But the problem with the variable here, if I put inside the function, let selected choice ID, let's initially have it null. The problem is React won't know about this as it goes about rendering the application. So let me demonstrate that. So if I go to the input here, what we're going to do is control it. So usually you want to set the value and the onChange. So the value attribute for this will come from selected choice ID. So if I do that, it's a fixed value right now. And you got the onChange that can be called whenever. By the way, I want to make this wrap because it's kind of annoying. So if I remember, I can click here, settings, editor, where is it? User preferences. I can search for word wrap and on, because I don't want to scroll horizontally every time. Okay, now it's wrapped. So on change, I can define a function here on choice change. And then outside, before the return, I can declare the function on choice change here. Now I can put the event as the parameter so I can get access to what was the choice, what was the value. But as we have it right now, every single radio doesn't have a specific value. So what we want to do is add a value attribute here instead of being the choice. This should be actually be checked, sorry. Because when we deal with checkbox or radio, to keep track of what's checked or not, it should be the checked attribute, not value. Value is actually what each of these will represent. So this, instead of value here, put checked. And then the value itself will be the ID of the choice, because I want to uniquely identify each radio with something different. So I can put choice.id because that's unique. So if I right click here in the dev tools, and this is what it looks like. You can see the first one has value 1 because that's ID 1. And then the subsequent ones will have value 2, and then value 3 and value 4. That's what I wanted. So that even though they're in the same group with the same name, question, choice, they have a different value. And then that way, when I click one of them, the function on change, on choice change, will be called with the event argument. And when I say event.target, that refers to the input itself, and I can get access to the value, right? And I can store this value in the selected choice ID variable I have here. But the problem is, you're going to see if I do it this way, it's not going to work. So if I click here, I put the value checked. Let me see what's going on. Hints. Let me show you the selected here. Where is the, let me put it outside. Just for debugging, I'll put selected choice ID here. Selected choice ID. For debugging purposes, I will write it here. Debugging. You can remove later. See, selected choice ID is still null. It's not changing it because React doesn't know about it. So the only way for React to know about it is to track the variable value in the React state. Now to do that, we use what's called a hook called useState. So instead of doing like this common variable, you want to keep track of things, store things in the state. So gotta go here and import React from React so that we can use the React module here. So I'm going to use React.useState here with null as the argument. So what I'm doing is, okay, React.useState, this is a hook, H-O-O-K. And you're saying, okay, I want to keep track of a state value. And the initial value is null. It could be anything you want here. Initially, it's going to be null because there's no selection. Okay, and then this thing here returns an array of two elements. The first is the variable, you can access the value itself. And the second is a function that can be used to modify that value, mutate it. So you're going to see people doing destructuring here a lot instead of using the array. Because if I do A here, for example, let A be that, the way I can access the thing, let me try console log it here. That's another way of debugging. Let me just rename it the same way. Sorry about that. What is that? Shouldn't be a problem anymore. I think if I open the dev tools with F, right click inspect, click console, I should be able to see. Let me put a text here, selected, colon, and I can filter here, selected. There you go. Now I can see this is the log of this part. Every time this component is rendered, that is the function is called, we're gonna see this value selected choice ID. You see it's an array, and the first is null because that's the initial value, and the second is a function here that we can use. This is a bound function object. Anyway, you're gonna see this a lot, like brackets, set, selected choice ID. What it's doing, it's taking the first element, the array, putting in the variable selected choice ID. And then the second is that function or bound function object. We can put it in the second variable called set select choice ID. So that whenever we need to change this value, we would call this function, pass the argument, the new value. Okay, if we do that, click a trash can to clear and refresh this. Let's see what we get there. See selected, now it's just selected source ID, the null value, and the other one is the function. Okay, with that, I can delete this because we're done debugging. Okay, and now if I click, let's see, I might check the still selected choice ID like before, even though now it's coming from the state. So if I click select, whoop, it's not doing anything because whenever I need to change it, I need to call this function set selected choice ID. So here you would say set selected choice ID and pass the event.target.value as the argument. Now, if I click, see that it's changing the selected choice ID into debugging. All right. Great. Okay, now the problem that we get it right now is checked. You see it's all bugged up, even though the number is correct here. So the selection is stored correctly, but the visual is wrong. And that's because I need to verify, okay, I'm only going to check this circle if the selected choice ID is equal to this choice ID. So to change that here in checked, I would say, okay, if the selected choice ID is equal to the choice.id, that is this specific choice that I'm looking at right now, if the ID is equal or matches what I selected, then I'm going to mark this as checked. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it unchecked. So that fixes the bug visual that I see. And there you go. Now that you know that it's selected correctly, you can remove the debugging here. So I taught you two ways of debugging: console log, or you can actually use interpolation in the template. So that's done. I delete that. Okay, now we're controlling. This is called a controlled input, or when you put the value and on change defined explicitly. Now we have access to the choice. Whenever I reference select the choice ID, I know that's the selection by the user. That way it can match with the correct answer or not. So when I click check answers, I want to be able to show some feedback on the right-hand side of the choice text saying whether this is the correct answer or it's incorrect. So let's do that. So when I want to check answers here, I click and calls check answers. Check answers, I want to set something, and that's to a flag to say, hey, all the answers should be verified, so that the UI will change according. So it can keep track of another state. So React, I'll use state. By the way, you might see this being used without React dot. And if you want to use that, all you have to do is go here in the import, put a comma, use state, and use a named import like that. That way you can use state without saying React dot. So if you don't want to, you might see that a lot as well. And then for this state, I want to make it a flag true or false. So initially, I don't want to verify the answers. So we're going to put that. And here, by the way, it could be a const. It doesn't have to be let because we're not reassigning. So const, let's say verify answers is the name I want to give to this variable, arbitrary. Set verify answers. You've noticed the pattern for the variable to access and the function variable to change. It is always verify answers and set whatever the name of the variable previously was. It's just a naming convention, but you could technically change this to anything you want. Anyway, so when I click check answers, I want to set verify answers to be true, meaning, okay, I want to show the feedback to the user. Now that we have this variable verify answers, we can use it to in the UI to show the feedback. So the feedback will be next to the choice text here, but I will do it outside the label. So thinking in terms of if else, it will be like this. If verify answers is true, I want to show whether it's correct or incorrect. That's what I want to do. Now to do this here, I'll kind of isolate the logic in a separate function. So we can also do that instead of writing inline. So I'm going to put the curly braces and I'm going to say here, see, should call it render feedback, and make this function that I'm going to call, and it's all it's doing is going to return some template for the feedback so that I can kind of isolate the logic and use if else. So function render feedback, and this should return some feedback. Now, before I do that, I got to check. Okay, remember that check. So if verify answers is true, I can just write it like this. I want to show whether it's correct or incorrect, but I only want to show that if the user picked that choice, because there could be many choices. I don't want to show correct and incorrect for each. I just want to show for the one that I picked. So I pick one, it's going to show correct or incorrect. So I'm only going to show this if verify answers double ampersand and The selected choice ID is the current choice that I'm looking at. But to access choice here, I can't, right? So I have to pass to this function. So this function will take a choice as the parameter. So when we call render feedback, we have to pass the choice. Remember, we have choice here. We have to pass it here. And like that. Okay. With that, I can put the if curly brace. Don't write twice. Let me remove this. Fix the indentation here. Add the closing there. Now I'm going to return something. But even before that, I got to verify, okay, is this choice correct or not? Okay, if the choice correct, I'm going to show correct. Okay, I'm going to return a span. I'm going to say correct. Maybe I can add an emoji with, I'm on Windows, so Windows key dot and put a check mark emoji there. And if it's not correct, else, let's return here a span command Windows dot cross, which is like incorrect. You don't have to have the emoji, it's just for sake of it. Anyway, so that's the logic there. So if verify answers has been called, meaning if I click the button to check the answers, and this choice I'm looking at as I'm rendering every choice, if I match the one that the user picked, I'm going to verify if the choice is correct and put a check mark next to it. Otherwise, an incorrect. Let's see it in practice. Let me choose the wrong one. You see, I click check answers is the things incorrect. And the way I have it right now, I can select anything. And because the verify answers is true, it's always showing whether it's incorrect or correct. But typically when you choose something, you want to disable selection. So you can actually disable it. If you go here where we have the input, you can disable that if you called, whoops, disabled. If you called to verify answers, right? Verify answers is true, this will be disabled. You see that? Now I can't choose anything. And that tackles that problem. Now let's add a reset button here so we can try it again. So if I add a button here, type button, on click is just reset answers. And reset is a label. Let's make the function reset answers here. Function reset answers. So this is simple. So to reset, this just means set the selected choice ID to null and set the verified answers to false, right? Because we don't want to show feedback because it's been reset. So two things, right? Two mutations of the state. And this reason this works is in React, it's like a reactive programming in the sense that whenever you change the state in React, it will trigger a re-render. That is, a re-render is a call to the component function again. So that's why this works. When I click this thing, for example, the first choice, what happens is it calls the on choice change, then it calls to set selected choice ID. This is a function that modifies or mutates the state, right? Because it's being tracked by the hook React use state. So because of this state change, React will notice, hey, you changed something in the state, therefore I'm going to re-render this, which means calling this function again. And then it has what's called a shadow DOM. So this shadow DOM is like a copy of the DOM that you see here if you right click. And it's going to notice, hey, this is different from the original. What I'm showing to the user is different from the one I just have right now because the user changed the state. And then this should be marked as checked. So what's going to happen is the next render, this function is called again. And when it comes to render the first input, the checked will be true because selected choice ID will match the one that I had just clicked, right? And that's why I clicked that and it's now showing checked. That's why it's called React. It reacts to changes in the application, in this case, state. Another thing that triggers change is the prop. So whenever a prop any of these value for the prop changes, it also triggers a re-render. Okay, so what else we got here? We can reset. I can check answers, can't choose anymore. I can reset. So now I can pick again and then click check answers. One thing would be nice to tell the user what's the right answer, right? Because I don't know what's the right answer. So let's do that. Well, to do that, we can add next to the right answer the feedback. So let's say here, when we render feedback, remember we have this function render feedback that's called for every single radio, but it's only render anything if it's the selection from the user, right? Because we have verify answers and selected choice is the choice the user picked. But we can add an else if here, else if you're still verifying the answers, true, but the selected choice ID is not what the user picked, right? The choice right now that I'm rendering is not what the user picked. In that case, I can check if this is the right answer, I'll show it this is the right answer, right? So I gotta also add if this choice is correct, if this is true. So if you call to verify the answers and the user picked something other than this choice, and this choice is the right answer. In that case, I will show a span saying with a finger pointing the right answer. So now you can see here, it tells me the P hello world is the right answer. Now, what if I reset and check answers without picking anything? It would be nice to tell the user you didn't pick anything. So we can also do that if you want. Go here right after or before check answers. You can say, okay, if we call to verify answers and the selected choice ID is null, meaning I didn't pick anything, I can render something. And that something could be a div saying you didn't answer this question. Now you notice I leverage a lot of double ampersand in these places, especially if it's inline in the JSX. You're gonna see that a lot. Because it's short circuit, meaning if the value on the left is false, everything to the right hand side is automatically ignored because it's an ampersand meaning and operation. For the and operation to work, everything has to be true. So every expression has to be true. If it's false, it automatically discards everything to the right because there's no point in checking. All of them have to be true. If one is false, why bother keep going? So it first checks if verify answers is true, and then it goes on to check if it's true. Okay, I'm going to check right hand side. Has the user selected nothing? If it's true, then I'll put there a div if you didn't answer this question. And you can see here, if I reset and click check answers, it shows me you didn't answer this question. Okay. Yeah, so just to summarize, when we had the question title, so the ampersand acts like a Boolean function for JS. Ampersand is just an operator, the AND operator. It can be used in the JSX to conditionally render something. If this verify answer is false, false is taken to be something that won't render. Like if I say false here, literal false is going to say false, but if I put it in curly brace, it's not going to show anything. And that's the point of this. If you verify answer is false, it doesn't show anything. If it's true, it goes to the next one. And if this is true, it goes to the next. But if it's false, it doesn't render anything. So that's the point. This is like equivalent. You putting if, verify answers, and double ampersand, selected choice is null. Return that, right? So we can write this in a separate function if you want. Render no answer. How about that? We can take this logic here and put in a separate function, render no answer. And then we paste the same logic. So either you place the same logic without the curly brace, or you could do the if else. I think it's easier to read, right? So if I do if verify answers and select the choice as null, you're gonna return this div like that. Let's see. Fix the syntax here. It's the opposite here. No need for that. Here, like that. So this is like the if, explicit if case. If that, then return this. If this is false, it returns undefined from the function. So if you put undefined in a JSX, it doesn't render anything. Remember line 90 here, if I put undefined, nothing gets rendered. That's why we leverage that a lot. Either false value, undefined, it's not gonna render. Let's try no. Even no doesn't render. Okay, that's why we always use that. Yeah, if you think this is easier this way, write it this way, other than the inline version. I think this one is clearer. Okay, render no answer, it's if, and then return that. Yeah, so basically you could replicate this, create a component for this that you could call the question component or something like that. Let me demonstrate here. If you want to create your own component, just create a function. Let's call it question, for example. And then the argument is usually the props that's passed in. You know, when you instantiate a component, we're going to see it soon. When you instantiate like this, you can pass props like that, which are the attributes, and they would appear in this props object here for access. In any case, return something from that. Let's take this thing here, all this stuff. Actually, I just want this is a little bit tricky because I would have to show you right now, because we have check answers. If we had multiple answers, it would have to call on this set selected choice ID and the other one. So that's a bit complicated to do right now. But I can just show you the template for the question. If you want to do the template instead of everything here, let's take we got the title here, and we got this, like that. Let's try to do just this part. So what you do is you copy that, paste it here. Let me put, so if you want to return something, you could put a div, or you can do what's called a fragment. If you don't want a div to be inserted there, you can use React.fragment. That's like a div, but there won't be any div included there. And people will often omit this name and put it like that. So if you have multiple things to return and you can't get it to work, just put a fragment like that. Now here, a props, you can pass, you see I don't have question available here. So that's the problem here. When I take this part and comment out, by the way, control / will comment this out. This is how you comment JSX with the curly brace /* in the beginning and then at the end here, */. So I'm going to replace that with a question like this. See, at my own custom component. But the problem is I don't have access to the question, so I would have to pass it in. To pass it in, you can put as a prop like this. Question is equal to question, like that. That's one way. Of course, here we're doing a global variable, so it probably doesn't matter. But that's the way you would pass it in. So that way, from the question here, you would say props.question. So props.question title, props.question.choice, so on. Some people like destructuring, meaning extracting this into a variable called question. You would do like const curly brace question equals props. That just means create a new variable called question that's extracted from the question property of those object props. You might see that a lot too. Okay, now the other thing I don't know is select choice ID. Now that's why I was telling you that's kind of complicated to do right now. I don't have much time, but suffice it to say, you could also pass that in. That's also a choice. You could say this is like coming from props dot selected choice ID. So you would go here where we instantiate a question, you pass it in, selected choice ID equals selected choice ID. Now this select choice ID, the value is what I have here. And the prop name is defined by the question component. So I don't have to have the same thing. I could change the select source ID 1, 2, 3. If I had it like this, I would have to change my prop name here to select the choice ID 1, 2, 3. Okay? But I think it's okay to be the same name, but they're not the same thing. Keep that in mind. Okay, now it's complaining about on choice change. So you can do the same. You can take that from props. Then it's going to complain by verify answers. Take that from props. You can see it's a little bit tedious. But that's just the way this is built. Probably there's a better way, but I'm just demonstrating how to press the props. So verify answers is verify answers. And you can break a line here if you want and write it like this. I think it's nicer to see. And what's the other one? On choice change equals on choice change. So you're like passing down from one component to the other. Now it's render feedback because I define it here. So I could actually move this function, cut it, move it to the question component before the return. And then I would have to say, okay, verify answers with the props dot, and then select the choice props dot. And now render no answer is not defined. Where's that? Oops, I copied the wrong one. Was that the wrong one? Sorry. Let's see. Yeah, sorry, I copied the wrong one. It's render feedback. Sorry about that. Let me take this one instead and paste it here. So I would say props dot, or you could just destructure here if you don't like same props. And then select the choice ID. And what's the other one? Oops, S, answers S. Now let's test it, see if it's still working. Okay, that seems okay. Reset. Okay, click the right answer. That's still working. Okay. So our refactoring into this question component worked okay. Okay, so that's how you create your custom one, passing the props from one component to the other, passing the information via props. It's probably a much better way, but this is the way you would do it. And then you could create more questions, but that's probably going to involve more things. You got to keep a track of in the state. You would have to have multiple choice IDs, right? Because there's so many questions. So this wouldn't be just one. You could maybe make an object of every choice, every question ID, or an array could work too. Something like that. But I think that's enough for this lesson.